The first time I understood that the pines carried spirits, I wasn't deep in the back country or standing at the mouth of some cursed cave. I was simply walking the narrow trail behind the ranger station, listening to the wind slide through the needles like breath through teeth. I was 24 then, barely a year into the job, and still convinced that logic alone could tame fear. But there was something about that morning, something in how the air trembled, how the light swayed, like it was nervous to touch the ground. Something that felt like the forest was paying attention to me in a way it hadn't before. My name isn't important, not really. What matters is that I grew up in a place where the woods formed the edges of every childhood memory I ever had. Pine sap on my fingers, used damp soil under my nails, the echo of my own footsteps chasing me through the trees. So when I joined the Forest Service, it didn't feel like a career choice. It felt more like returning to a place that had been waiting for me. I worked in the northern stretch of a national forest most folks outside this state haven't heard much about. The kind where visitors imagine the usual: deer crossing dusty service roads, picturesque overlooks, weekend hikers clumping along with trekking poles, and oversized water bottles. But that's the surface. Locals know better. They speak of shadows where there shouldn't be any, of voices that sound like family members calling from between the trees, of something that roams the high ridges in winter, leaving prints that don't match anything in the wildlife database. When I started, I dismissed all of that as folklore, small-town legends, the kind that swell whenever nights grow long and alcohol flows easily. That confidence would become my weakness. And the woods, as I learned, have a way of correcting weaknesses. I had been assigned to a small outpost tucked between two rising slopes, a place the old-timers called Pine Watch. Not officially, of course. Its real designation was something sterile and bureaucratic. But Pine Watch fit better. The pines there grew tall and tightly packed, almost claustrophobic, and at dusk their silhouettes lined up like silent sentinels. My mentor back then was a man named Grady. He'd spent nearly 30 years patrolling these woods, and he carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who'd survived more than he cared to tell. He was in his 50s, built like someone who hauled fallen logs for fun, with a voice that rumbled like a low storm. And though he never said so out loud, he feared the woods in a way that didn't match his size or his strength. Not panic fear, more like respect sharpened into instinct. On my second week, he told me something that I interpreted as a joke at the time. Keep your ears open in the pines. That's where the spirits linger, even when everything else goes quiet. He didn't smile when he said it. I did. I learned quickly that locals didn't treat the forest like a backdrop. They treated it like a neighbor, a dangerous one. The kind you don't make eye contact with for too long. They told stories about disappearances, about animals found mutilated in patterns too clean to blame on predators, about deep caves that breathed out warm air, even in December. There was one legend I heard before anything strange happened to me. They called it the White Walker. Not the fantasy creature from TV, not a ghost, not exactly human either. A tall, pale figure said to roam the tree line at night, gliding instead of walking. People claimed it moved like a reflection on water, smooth, distorted, wrong. I brushed it off. The human imagination loves monsters, and the forest gives it room to stretch. But there was a strange detail that bothered me. Every witness described the same thing. Not its face, not its shape, but the scent that came before it. Cold sap and wet stone. It didn't make sense. Scents weren't supposed to be consistent across stories. They weren't supposed to be identical. I tried not to dwell on it. My first real encounter with fear, real fear, happened late one evening after Grady had sent me out to check a section of trail because a hiker had reported hearing crying near a cave. The sky had already gone dark, the kind of dark that makes your flashlight feel small and insecure. The wind was sharp that night, slicing between the pines and carrying the scent of something crisp and metallic I couldn't place. I kept telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a fawn. They scream sometimes when they're distressed, and to someone unfamiliar with the woods, That can sound eerily human. But as I hiked up the ridge, I started questioning that assumption. The crying didn't echo the way an animal cries should. It wasn't intermittent. It didn't shift in pitch. It was steady, unnatural. Like it was waiting for me. The cave was small, more like a den carved into the side of the hillside, barely big enough for a person to crawl into. The crying was coming from inside it. Soft, rhythmic, muffled. I stood at the entrance, leaning forward, breathing quietly, listening. The crying stopped, not gradually, not fading out. Stopped. Silence moved in like fog. My breath fogged in front of my face, even though it wasn't cold enough for that. I remember that detail vividly because it was the first moment I felt that prick of irrationality, when your mind tries to align what you see with what you feel and fails. I angled my flashlight in. The beam hit nothing but rock. Then something exhaled. I felt it, not heard it. A warm, damp breath rolled across my face from deep in the cave. Warm, not cold. Warm like something alive was inches away from me. Something large. I froze, not out of discipline, out of instinct, pure animal instinct. I remember thinking, if I lift my light higher, I'll see something I'm not ready to see. A rustle came from deeper inside, like something shifting its weight. I stepped back slowly, keeping my beam low, and then I caught it. A scent. Cold sap, wet stone. My whole spine tensed, my mouth turned dry, my mind contradicted itself. Part of me whispered that this was just a trapped animal. Another part insisted that no animal smelled like that. I didn't need Grady to tell me what to do. I backed away until the cave was just a darker hole in a wall of darkness. Then I turned and walked. Not fast, not running, just controlled footsteps, because something told me that running would make whatever was inside that cave follow. It wasn't until I reached the main trail that I realized my hands were shaking. When I got back to Pine Watch, Grady was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee like he knew exactly what had happened. He looked at me, eyes heavy, and said only one thing, "You heard it, didn't you?" That's when I realized he hadn't sent me to check that cave because of a hiker report. He'd sent me because he wanted me to hear the spirits of the pines for myself. Grady didn't ask me to sit. He didn't motion me inside or offer me coffee or tell me what he already knew. He simply held my gaze the way an older ranger does when he's assessing whether the forest has just introduced itself to you in the only language it truly speaks: fear. I remember the weight of that moment, how the night settled around Pine Watch like a thick blanket, how the pines behind the station whispered against each other even though the wind had gone still. That's always what bothered me most about this place. The way the trees behaved as if they were part of a conversation you weren't invited to join. I swallowed, steadying my voice. I didn't tell him what I'd felt at the cave. I didn't tell him about the breath. I didn't tell him about the scent. You heard it, didn't you? He had said it like he wasn't asking about the crying, like he meant something else entirely. So I said the only thing that felt safe. There was something in that cave. He nodded. Not like I'd told him new information, but like I'd finally accepted a truth he'd been waiting for me to discover. Some things out here don't care for being seen, he murmured. Others want to be seen too much. His cup steamed in the cold air. You'll learn the difference. For the next several weeks, I threw myself into the job the way young rangers do, overcompensating, eager, trying to prove to myself that what I'd experienced had a rational explanation. Tracks, scat, trail maintenance, lost hikers, illegal camping sites. It was easier to bury myself in the tangible than to acknowledge the intangible. But something had changed. I began noticing details I'd never noticed before. Small things at first, barely perceptible shifts. A branch cracking when nothing should have been heavy enough to break it. A shadow sliding behind a tree where no shadow should fall. The feeling of being watched, not constantly, but consistently. At first, I convinced myself it was just heightened awareness, a natural response after an unsettling night. But awareness doesn't follow you home. Awareness doesn't creep into your dreams. Awareness doesn't distort silence into something with weight and intent. One night, about a month after the cave incident, I was patrolling the lower valley alone. It was a cold night, the kind that freezes water in thin sheets over puddles and makes the air feel sharper, cleaner. My breath drifted ahead of me like ghostly fog, curling between the pines. I was halfway down a narrow switchback trail when I heard it. A knock. Not a random branch hitting another. Not a woodpecker. Not wind. A clean, definite knock. Like knuckles on a door. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. It came from deep in the trees, beyond the trail's edge, far enough away that the darkness swallowed everything, but close enough that I could feel it in my chest. I scanned the area with my flashlight, slow and steady, sweeping the beam across the slope. The forest didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't sigh. It just stared back at me with 1,000 silent trunks. I waited, holding my breath. 3 taps. This time, closer. Something in me tightened. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was tension, like a thin wire pulling me in 2 directions. Logic on one side, instinct on the other. Hello? I called out, because that's what protocol demanded if you suspected a person was in distress. My voice sounded too loud, embarrassingly loud, against the hush of the forest. Silence followed, but there was a feeling behind the silence. A waiting, almost curious stillness. I took a step off the trail, then another. The underbrush crunched under my boots. My beam cut through the trees. I angled the light left, then right. Then something moved. Fast. A flash of pale, tall shape slipping between 2 pines, too smooth to be a person, too upright to be an animal. It didn't crash or stumble or brush against branches. It glided. I inhaled sharply, stepping back onto the trail. That's when the scent hit me. Cold sap. Wet stone. My body remembered before my mind did. And fear, real unfiltered fear, unfolded inside me like a living thing. But I didn't run. I forced myself to exhale slowly, grounding my feet in the dirt, reminding myself that panic is where the forest does its best hunting. I turned and continued down the trail, faster now, but not frantic. Every few steps, I checked behind me, scanning the trees. Nothing followed, nothing moved. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It grew. When I finally reached the trailhead, the night felt different, the air lighter, the silence less suffocating. I radioed in to Grady to report what I'd seen. I wanted him to tell me it was a trick of the light, that my mind was mapping shadows into figures to compensate for stress. But he didn't. He listened for a long time, then said, "It's testing you." Testing me how? Seeing what kind of ranger you'll become. The next morning, Grady brought me to an area the locals called Breaker's Hollow, a bowl-shaped stretch of dense pines where sightings of the White Walker were most common. The hike was strenuous, almost punishing, but he didn't slow down to match my pace. It was as if he wanted exhaustion to soften my defenses. When we reached the hollow, he stopped at the edge and stared into the trees with a face carved from worry. "This place changes people," he said. "Some come out sharper, some come out quieter, some don't come out at all." He pointed at the tree line. "Look there." I squinted. At first I saw nothing but overlapping trunks. But as my eyes adjusted, something stood out. Claw marks. 3 parallel grooves running down a pine, starting 10 feet up and ending a few inches from the ground. The cuts were clean, deep, and spaced far wider than any bear could manage. They were fresh. I stepped closer, hand hovering above the marks. "Don't touch it," Grady warned. "Why not?" "Because whatever made those wasn't marking territory. It was leaving a message." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The woods were speaking, and I was only just learning their language. Over the next year, strange occurrences became part of my routine. Not daily, but often enough that they stopped surprising me. The knocks returned sporadically. Sometimes distant, sometimes right outside my cabin door. I saw shapes in the trees, flickering pale figures that vanished when approached. Trails shifted, subtly but unmistakably. A path that should have led me back to the station would twist unexpectedly and spit me out 2 miles north. But the worst was the scent. Cold sap, wet stone. Sometimes it drifted through my cabin window at night, strong enough to wake me, pooling in the corners of the room like fog. Other times it hit me in the middle of a sunny afternoon. No cave, no shadow, no figure in sight. The forest knew I was there, and it didn't want me to forget. But fear didn't break me, not then. What broke me was the person who went missing. Her name was Mara, a local, a regular hiker. Someone who treated the forest with a respect that bordered on reverence. She disappeared on a clear autumn day with no storms, no predators, no logical explanation. I was assigned to the search team. I felt responsible, though I didn't say it. Rangers always feel responsible. They're the last line between the woods and anyone who enters them. We combed ridges, ravines, riverbanks. We found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of struggle, nothing except one thing. Near the edge of Breaker's Hollow, the scent hit me again. Cold sap, wet stone, so strong I nearly choked. And that's when I realized something terrifying. The forest wasn't just watching me anymore. It wanted me to follow. I stood at the edge of Breaker's Hollow with the scent tightening in my throat, my breath hitching the way it does when instinct overrides whatever confidence you think you've earned. Behind me, the other rangers called out Mara's name and practiced patterns. 3 shouts, pause, listen. But their voices felt thin, distant, swallowed by something thick moving in the air between the pines. I stepped forward. Not because I wanted to, not because it was protocol, but because every part of me felt pulled, like my ribs were hooked from the inside and tugged toward the dark seam of trees ahead. It was as if the forest had reached out, gripped me, and whispered a direction not in words but in sensation. Grady caught my arm. "Don't," he said, low and certain. I pulled my gaze from the trees and met his eyes. I could tell he felt it too. The scent, the pressure, the wrongness. "She's in there," I said, though I had no proof. None. He shook his head. "Not the way you think." That sentence would haunt me later when I understood its weight. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about supernatural logic or ancient legends. I was thinking about a woman I'd seen on the trail a dozen times, always with a warm smile and a respectful nod. I was thinking about her careful steps, her familiarity with the land, her trust in us. I stepped toward the hollow again. Grady's grip tightened. "Listen to me, kid. The forest is talking to you. That doesn't mean you should answer," but I had already made up my mind. I radioed the search team to reassign our sweep to the northern ridge, told them I'd circle through the hollow alone to check a gap they might have missed. I could hear the hesitation in their responses, but I outranked only one of them, and Grady didn't say a word, just watched me with that same troubled expression he'd carried for as long as I'd known him. The first steps into Breaker's Hollow always feel different, even before I understood why. The light dims unnaturally, the temperature drops a few degrees, and the soundscape shifts subtly, clearly undeniably, like stepping through a membrane into another world. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't nerves, it was real. The forest changed here, and something else lived inside that change. The trail narrowed to a tight squeeze between 2 old pines that leaned inward unnaturally, forming an arch. As I walked beneath it, a chill rolled down my arms. My breath fogged, and the scent of cold sap and wet stone burst from the darkness like a warning. I took out my flashlight despite it being daylight. My fingers trembled when I clicked it on, the beam slicing through the shadow-drenched undergrowth. "Mara?" I called softly. Only silence answered. But it wasn't empty silence. It had weight, intention. I moved deeper. The hollow seemed to expand and compress in strange ways. Paths that should have wound left curved right instead. Old trees that had stood in the same places for decades now seemed crowded closer together, like a house rearranging its furniture when no one was looking. After 20 minutes of weaving between trunks, I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. Not from maps, not from memory of anywhere. The clearing looked manufactured, too round, too smooth, too deliberate. At its center stood a single pine, taller than the others, wrongly tall, as if it hadn't grown so much as been pulled upward. Its bark was pale, almost white, like bleached bone wrapped in wood grain. A cold spike of dread slipped down my spine. At the base of the tree, half covered by needles, was something dark. Fabric. My pulse kicked. I rushed forward, falling to my knees and sweeping aside debris with shaking hands. A jacket. Mara's jacket. I recognized it immediately, green, patched at the elbows with a small embroidered fox on the collar. She'd shown me that patch once, laughing about how her niece sewed it crooked. But the jacket was clean. Too clean. It hadn't been ripped, dragged, or weathered. It looked like someone had set it there gently. I lifted it slowly. Beneath it were footprints. Human. Bare. But something was wrong with them. The size matched Mara's small feet, but the depth, God, the depth, was all wrong. They were pressed inches into the soil as if whoever made them weighed 200 pounds, 300 pounds. Fear flickered into something sharper, a cold, slicing certainty. She hadn't walked away from here. Something had carried her. A crack echoed through the clearing. I froze. Not a branch falling, not an animal scurrying. A footstep, deliberate, heavy. I rose slowly, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and turned toward the far edge of the clearing. Something stood between the trees. Tall, wrongly tall. Pale skin reflecting the weak daylight. Too smooth. Too stretched. No clothes, no hair, no features except the faint impression of where eyes should have been. It moved its head toward me, but not smoothly, not mechanically. Like it wasn't used to moving the way a neck should move. Like it was imitating the concept of looking rather than performing it naturally. Every part of me screamed to run. Instead, I lifted my light higher. The creature, thing, took a step into the clearing. Its footfall shook the earth. Cold sap, wet stone. The scent blasted against me like a wave. My knees nearly buckled. Its limbs seemed too long, its joints bending subtly wrong. It didn't walk. It glided with an undercurrent of muscle movement as though gravity applied differently to its body. It stopped 5 feet from me. In my peripheral vision, Mara's footprints led straight to its side of the clearing, and then vanished, as if she had stepped into its shadow and never stepped out. My throat dried to sand. I tried to speak and nothing came out. Then the creature leaned slightly forward as if sniffing the air, and from deep in its chest came a sound so quiet I almost mistook it for breath. A single shaky exhale, wet, heavy, too warm. The same breath I'd felt at the cave. Something inside me cracked. I stepped back. It stepped forward. My instincts finally won. I turned and ran. I crashed through brush, stumbled over roots, scraped against bark, branches tearing at me as if the forest itself wanted me to stay. My heartbeat drowned out everything except the pounding of its footsteps, slow, steady, gaining. I didn't look back. Looking back would break me. The trail twisted in impossible ways. Paths that should have led down slope suddenly rose. Switchbacks folded into dead ends. Familiar landmarks rearranged themselves. The hollow was shifting around me, closing, tightening, trapping. I called for Grady over the radio. Breathless, panicked, my words slurred by adrenaline. No response, only static. Then, faintly, another sound layered beneath the static. My name. Not spoken, mimicked, squeezed through vocal cords that weren't meant for human language. I almost fell from how wrong it sounded. I pushed harder, lungs burning, vision tunneling. The forest blurred. My legs shook. My mind spiraled through layers of denial and acceptance so quickly it made me dizzy. Then, I saw it. The arch. The 2 leaning pines at the hollow's edge. I stumbled through them, collapsing onto the more familiar trail beyond. The moment I crossed that threshold, the scent vanished. The air warmed. The silence loosened. The footsteps behind me stopped. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. I only listened. For several long moments, nothing. Then, from the darkness inside the arch, came 3 slow, delicate knocks. Tap, tap. I staggered backward until my spine hit a tree, gasping, gripping the bark like an anchor. Grady arrived minutes later, bursting through the brush, his face pale, his radio still crackling in his hand. When he saw me, he didn't ask what happened. He already knew. He only looked past me, toward the arch, and whispered, "The forest didn't take you today, but it wanted to." Grady helped me to my feet, but he didn't touch me. He hovered close enough to steady me if I fell again, yet far enough to give me space, as if he knew the forest's grip was still on me, just loosened, not gone. My legs trembled with the memory of the creature's breath, with the echo of those 3 hollow knocks drifting through the arch behind us. Even now, standing beyond that invisible threshold, I felt its attention lingering, watching, waiting. "We need to leave," Grady murmured. Not loud, not urgent, just certain. I nodded, because speaking felt impossible. My throat was raw, scraped from running, from choking on fear, from breathing air that felt thick enough to drown in. We moved down the trail slowly, my steps uneven, Grady glancing back every few seconds. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look afraid. He'd always carried a quiet reverence for this place, a wary respect that bordered on superstition. But fear? Real fear? That was new. And it terrified me more than anything I'd seen inside Breaker's Hollow. By the time we reached Pine Watch, my mind had begun to untangle itself just enough for me to speak. I saw it. The words came out in a whisper. I didn't mean to say them. I didn't mean to break the fragile silence that held the weight of what had happened. But once they were out, it felt like a dam collapsing. Grady stopped walking. He didn't turn around, didn't face me. He just stood there, shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. "You weren't supposed to," he finally said. I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he guided me onto the porch, handed me a thermos of warm water, and sat across from me like a father preparing to tell his child the truth about something too complicated, too dark, too old. "It lets itself be seen," he said after a long pause, "but only by the ones it chooses." I stared at him. "The forest chooses people? Not the forest," he said softly. "Something in it." A gust of wind rattled the porch screens. The pines shifted with a low groan, tall silhouettes swaying like restless giants. I wanted to argue, tell him that whatever I saw wasn't choosing anything, that it was hunting. But the memory of its smooth, gliding steps silenced me. The creature hadn't chased me in rage. It had followed me with an unnerving patience, a predatory confidence that didn't need speed to catch what it wanted. I told him about the footprints, the jacket, the clearing. He listened without interrupting, his eyes heavy, his jaw tight, absorbing every detail like he had been waiting years to hear them said aloud. When I finished, he rubbed his hands together slowly, almost mechanically. "We won't find Mara," he said. The words cut through me like cold water. "You don't know that." He met my eyes then, and the sorrow in his expression hit me harder than any fear in the hollow. "I do. Because she's not the first." Silence spread between us, thick and suffocating. I felt the edges of it press in, the way a cave presses on your breath the deeper you go. "You should have told me," I said. My voice shook with something between anger and grief. "We don't talk about the ones the forest takes," he said quietly. "Not to rookies, not to outsiders, not even to each other." That was the moment I understood why the locals whispered instead of spoke, why they offered warnings shaped like riddles, why the stories never had endings, because endings didn't happen here. The forest didn't give people back, not whole, not alive, not ever. A sharp crack echoed from the trees behind the station. I jolted. Grady tensed, but it wasn't the creature, just a branch under the weight of winter's approach. Still, both of us stayed quiet until the forest settled again. I finally asked the question that had been burning inside me since the moment I saw the thing step into the clearing. "What is it?" Grady didn't look at me. He stared at the tree line as if the answer were carved into the bark. "Some say it's a spirit," he murmured. "Others say it's older, older than the trees, older than the mountains. Something this land buried long ago but never killed." He exhaled slowly. "And some say it's what the forest becomes when it's angry." I shook my head. That didn't make sense. Anger had a shape, a heat. What I saw had neither. It wasn't emotional. It was purposeful, like hunger given form. "It watches us," he continued. "It keeps track. It chooses moments, people, places. It pushes the forest into shapes that suit it. Breaker's Hollow is just one of its rooms." Rooms? "The forest isn't just trees," he said. "Not here. It's a structure, a shifting one. It expands, contracts, rearranges. Every year the maps go wrong because the land itself moves." I thought about the twisted paths, the shifting clearings, the arch of leaning pines that felt like an entrance rather than a natural formation. "The forest is alive," he said. "But that thing, whatever it is, it's the part that knows we're here." A chill crawled up my arms. "Then why show itself to me?" I asked. "Why now?" He hesitated for the first time. "Because it's changing," he said. The balance is different this year. The disappearances are closer together, the sightings more frequent. He leaned forward. The forest is choosing again. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its pale skin emerging from between the pines, the heavy footprints sinking inches into soft earth, the hint of breath against my cheek. I lay awake listening to the wind push against the cabin walls, waiting for the echo of 3 knocks, or worse, the scent of cold sap and wet stones sliding under the door. But nothing came. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Days passed. Search efforts continued for Mara, but dwindled when no new evidence turned up. Locals offered condolences in clipped, knowing tones. Some lit candles in windows facing the woods. Others hammered iron nails into their doorframes, a tradition I'd once dismissed as superstition. I didn't dismiss anything anymore. Grady watched me carefully during that time. Not like a supervisor, like someone who knew I'd been marked by something I couldn't see yet. A week after Mara vanished, a call came in about a collapsed cave entrance near the northern ridge. A hiker reported hearing rumbling underground, felt the ground shake beneath him. We needed to investigate. Part of me hoped the cave led somewhere connected to the clearing. Part of me prayed it didn't. We hiked up the ridge early in the morning, frost crunching under our boots, our breath hanging in the icy air. Grady walked ahead of me, unusually quiet, his shoulders hunched as though waiting for the land to shift beneath us. When we reached the cave, it was clear the collapse had been recent. Fresh rock dust coated the ground. Jagged stones jutted out like broken teeth. The opening was sealed by boulders that didn't look like they'd fallen naturally. They looked placed. Grady knelt, pressing his palm against one of the larger rocks. His frown deepened. This wasn't a cave collapse, he said. Then what? A low, distant rumble cut me off. It came from deep within the earth, vibrating through the soil, trembling up my legs. I staggered back. The forest held its breath. Grady stood slowly. It's waking up more often now, he said. Whatever it is. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but the scent hit me so suddenly it nearly dropped me to my knees. Cold sap. Wet stone. Stronger than ever. Grady's face drained of color. Run. He didn't shout it. He didn't explain. He just turned and sprinted for the ridge. I hesitated for one fatal heartbeat, and then from inside the sealed cave, something knocked 3 times. Slow, deliberate, inviting. The sound froze the air around us. It was impossible. Just impossible. The cave was sealed, suffocated under tons of rock that no human could move, and yet the knocks were unmistakable. 3 steady taps, like knuckles on an ancient door waiting for permission to enter. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Couldn't think. The echoes rolled through the ridge like a pulse from the earth itself, as if something enormous exhaled beneath our feet. Grady didn't look back. Didn't hesitate. His boots tore across the frost-slick ground as he ran, leaving a sharp trail of broken ice behind him. It was the first time I'd seen him run from anything, and the sight of it snapped me from my paralysis. I bolted after him, my legs heavy, my lungs burning as cold air scraped my throat raw. The trees blurred beside me, tall shadows streaking past like pillars in a collapsing cathedral. Behind us came a grinding sound, deep, guttural, like stone being dragged across stone. It was moving, not fast, not aggressively, just moving. And the knowledge that it was shifting beneath the earth, adjusting its position, responding to our presence, made the hair on the back of my neck rise like static. We tore down the ridge trail, boots thundering across frozen roots, branches whipping our arms and shoulders. The forest groaned around us, unsettled, its silence replaced by a low vibration that seemed to run through the soil more than the air. It felt like running across the chest of some sleeping animal that had begun to stir. Grady didn't slow until we reached the bottom of the ridge where the trail flattened into a wide patch of old leaf litter. Only then did he stop, leaning against a tree, chest heaving. I bent over, hands on my knees, struggling to steady my breath. "What was that?" I gasped. He didn't answer. Not right away. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight enough to whiten his knuckles around the strap of his radio. "Tell me," I said. "Because I saw the cave. I know what I heard. I know what followed me before. He looked up slowly. Something old, he said. Too old for names. Too old for stories. Too old for us. I swallowed hard. But it sounded like, don't say it, he cut in sharply. That word has weight here. The knocks, he nodded, grim and slow. It mimics, it calls, it learns. A chill crept down my spine, colder than the winter air. Then the cave wasn't collapsing on its own. No, he whispered. It was closing. The trees around us rustled subtly, though no wind touched them. The forest felt tense, like an animal crouched low, waiting. We need to head back, Grady said. I started to nod, but something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. Tracks. Not fresh, not new, but sharp enough to be unmistakable. Human footprints, bare, small, deep. I crouched, brushing aside a layer of frost. Mara. Grady saw them too. His eyes tightened. They weren't there when we arrived, I said. No, they weren't, he agreed quietly. A single trail of prints led toward the ridge, then stopped abruptly, as if she had simply vanished into the air, or been lifted, or taken. I felt nausea twist inside me, heavy and rising. We didn't follow the tracks. Neither of us had to say why. The air was too charged, the forest too aware of us. Even Grady knew we were outmatched. We made our way back to Pine Watch in silence. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the darkness pressing against my window. The scent of cold sap drifted faintly through the cracks in the cabin walls, not strong enough to send me running, but enough to keep sleep far away. It felt like a reminder, a whisper, a tether. Hours passed, maybe more. I wasn't sure. Time didn't behave normally in that forest. Just when my eyes finally began to close, something tapped the side of the cabin. Once, then again, then a third time. My blood turned to ice. I sat up slowly, breath shallow, heart pounding in my ears. Tap, 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 soft, deliberate, too rhythmic to be branches in the wind. My legs felt numb as I swung them off the bunk. I moved to the window with the caution of someone approaching a cliff's edge in the dark. I knew I shouldn't look. Knew nothing good would come from giving attention to whatever waited outside. But something inside me, a terrible mixture of curiosity and dread, pushed me forward. I lifted the curtain. Nothing. Just the tree line. Shadowed. Still. No movement. No figure. No footprint in the fresh frost. I let out a shaking breath, only to freeze when the scent hit me again. Cold sap. Wet stone. It seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, through the loose planks near the door, like a vapor drifting around my ankles. The hairs on my arms rose in waves. This wasn't a hunt. This was a message. I backed away from the window, pulse hammering, my mind grasping for logic but finding only fragments of fear. Memories struck me in disjointed pieces, the cave breath, the pale figure, Mara's footprints, the shifting paths, the sealed cave knocking, the voice mimicking my name through the radio. The forest had marked me, and now it wanted something. The knocking stopped, but I didn't sleep until dawn broke pale and cold across the horizon. When the sun rose, Grady and I set out on patrol together. He insisted. He didn't need to say why. We followed a trail that wound near the edge of Breaker's Hollow, avoiding crossing into it. The pines were coated in thin ice, their needles shimmering like glass shards under the morning light. We walked in silence until he finally spoke. "You need to understand something," he said without looking at me. "The forest isn't just acting up, it's shifting, preparing. For what?" He paused, jaw tightening. "For winter. But not the kind you know." He stopped walking, turning to face me fully. "There's an old belief around here, older than this station, older than any ranger who's ever worn the badge." He lifted his gaze toward the tree line. Every few decades, something sleeps lighter, something hungers deeper. The land tightens, the disappearances increase, and the forest changes shape to make room for it. "You think it has a cycle?" I asked, trying to swallow the dryness in my throat. He nodded. "Everything in nature has a cycle. Storms, seasons, predators. Even the things we don't understand." We resumed walking, our boots crunching on frozen leaves. I didn't ask the next question. It asked itself inside me. Why me? Why was I being drawn deeper, pushed closer, shown more? Maybe it sensed something in me. Fear, weakness, curiosity, lineage. Maybe I had stepped into one of its shifting paths at the exact wrong moment. Maybe Mara's disappearance wasn't coincidence but consequence. Maybe I had crossed an unseen threshold long before I realized it. Hours later, as we made our way back to Pine Watch, we heard a distant echo rolling through the forest. Faint at first, then clearer. 3 knocks, carried on the wind, too far to locate, too close to ignore. Grady stopped walking. I stopped breathing. The forest held its breath. Again, 3 knocks, this time from a different direction. Then a third set, farther yet, as if circling us. Something's moving, Grady whispered, something big. I felt the woods tighten around us, the pines shifting, the air thickening with pressure. The cycle had begun, and I was standing in its center. The forest closed around us like a pair of lungs tightening. The knocks kept drifting through the trees, each set coming from a different direction, as if whatever made them was circling, mapping us, testing the edges of our fear. Grady scanned the pines with the eyes of someone who had spent decades learning the forest's moods, and even he looked overwhelmed. It wasn't just the knocks themselves, it was the rhythm, the pattern, the intention threaded through each hollow tap. It wasn't calling out, it was communicating. We should head back, Grady said, though his voice lacked conviction. He looked like a man considering an exit that no longer existed. The trail behind us seemed narrower than before, the trees leaning in just slightly more than they had moments earlier. Subtle shifts, growing closeness, little hints that the forest was reshaping itself to keep us here. I felt it too. The pressure of something unseen pressing against the edges of perception, altering the land the way a tide shapes shorelines. We took a few steps, but the knocks returned, louder this time, echoing across the frozen canopy. I couldn't tell where they came from anymore. They ricocheted in every direction, confusing, disorienting, like sound bouncing between the walls of a cavern. Then the scent hit us. Cold sap, wet stone, thicker than ever before. It coated the back of my throat, clinging like mist. Grady stiffened. "It's close," he whispered. I could see his breath in the air, though the temperature hadn't dropped far enough for that. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, syncing with the knocks, creating a rhythm that felt like it was trying to pull something loose inside me, something instinctive, something buried and ancient. We kept moving. But the woods warped around us. A path that should have led straight began curving subtly left. A downed log that had always been a familiar landmark was nowhere to be seen. The incline of the trail shifted under our feet, rising where it should have leveled, dipping where it should have climbed. "It's rearranging again," Grady muttered. "Haven't seen it this active since." He stopped himself. "Since when?" He swallowed, not answering. That alone told me enough. Whatever had happened before, whatever he'd lived through or lost, was repeating. The knocks ceased. The sudden stillness felt like stepping into the center of a held breath. Even the pines seemed frozen, needles motionless, branches taut with expectation. Grady lifted a hand, urging me to halt. I obeyed, though I could barely stand still. My legs twitched with the urge to run, but run where? The forest wasn't a place anymore. It was a maze, a shifting stomach slowly digesting the land itself. Then we heard it. Not knocking, not footsteps. Breathing. Wet, heavy, rattling breathing coming from somewhere ahead, just beyond a cluster of old-growth pines. I felt the vibration of each exhale in my bones. A shape shifted in the shadows, not yet visible but present, undeniable, too tall to be anything natural. Grady stepped in front of me. "Stay behind me." His voice trembled. The strongest man I knew, shaking. The realization punched something out of me. The shape edged forward. Pale skin caught a sliver of light. Not bright, not reflective, just wrong. Like the world didn't know how to cast shadows on it. Grady drew his firearm, but even I knew it was pointless. You can't put a bullet into something that moves like fog and breathes like a cavern. The creature stepped between the pines, taller than I remembered, limbs too long, bending at unfamiliar angles, its head tilted in tiny, jerky motions, like it was testing different ways of observing us, not out of curiosity, out of mimicry. Behind us, the forest groaned, trees shifting, trunks leaning closer, the land tightening like a snare. Grady spoke to it. He didn't yell, didn't plead, didn't draw authority from his badge or his experience. He just spoke with the broken calm of a man talking to a storm he knew he couldn't outrun. "You don't need him," he said. "Take me." The creature twitched, not like an animal reacting to sound, but like a puppet processing unfamiliar language. I stepped forward instinctively, but Grady flung out an arm, barring me. His eyes cut to mine, sharp, fierce, desperate. "Run when I say," he whispered. "No," I hissed. "You don't get a say in this, kid." The creature lifted its head slightly. The scent thickened. Something moved beneath the ground, a low vibration rolling through the soil like a warning. A fissure of dread cracked open inside me. I understood then. The cycle he described wasn't just some superstition, it was real. And this thing, this towering, pale sentinel of the forest, was the herald of whatever lay beneath it. Another step. The ground shook. Grady steadied himself, but his voice softened in a way that made the world tilt. This forest takes who it marks, not who it wants, who it needs. Before I could respond, the creature lunged. Not fast, not explosive, just inevitable. Grady shoved me sideways with all his strength, sending me crashing into the brush. My head struck a fallen limb, vision bursting into white sparks. I blinked through the disorientation, scrambling to rise, but what I saw locked me into place. The creature had its hand, if you could call it that, wrapped around Grady's shoulder. Not grabbing, enveloping. Its fingers lengthened unnaturally, molding to his shape. Grady didn't scream. He simply looked toward me, eyes wide but not afraid, resigned. Run. It didn't sound like a command. It sounded like goodbye. The forest began to shift. Trees leaned inward, roots lifting, soil rippling like disturbed water. The creature's limbs wrapped further around Grady, pulling him closer to its chest, his body already sinking unnaturally into its pale surface, like a stone disappearing into mud. I stumbled backward, tripping, scrambling to my feet. "Run," Grady barked, his final spark of anger flaring through sheer will. The forest roared. I ran. I don't remember the path, don't remember the trees, don't remember the roots that grabbed at my boots or the branches that clawed my arms. I only remember the feeling of the forest collapsing inward, closing behind me like a mouth swallowing its meal. The knocks followed me at first, 3 at a time, bouncing through the trees, urging, mocking, chasing. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. Not when my legs buckled. Not when tears froze on my cheeks. And when I finally burst into the clearing near Pine Watch, collapsing onto the cold ground, the forest behind me went still. No knocks, no scent, no movement, just silence. Horrible, heavy silence. Grady never returned. Not that night, not in the days that followed, not ever. The search teams found no signs of him, no footprints, no torn fabric, no weapon, no trail. It was as if the forest had rewritten itself, erasing the moment he vanished. The official report blamed unstable terrain. I didn't argue. Truth wasn't meant for paperwork. I left Pine Watch that winter, but the forest didn't leave me. Not really. Sometimes in the early hours of dawn, I still hear the knocks, faint, distant, as if carried across miles. Sometimes the scent of cold sap slips through an open window, startling me awake. Sometimes I dream of Grady's last look, the way he seemed to pass the forest's mark onto me with his final breath. And the worst part? Deep down, I know the cycle hasn't ended. I was spared, not saved. Spared. Because the forest isn't done choosing. And one day, whether I'm ready or not, I'll have to go back to where it all began. Back to the pines, back to the hollow, back to the cave that breathes, because something beneath this land still knocks, 3 taps at a time, calling for those it marked, calling for me. And I know, when the forest whispers again, I will answer. The first time I heard the pines breathing, I thought it was just the wind, until the wind stopped, and the sound didn't. My name is not important yet. What matters is that, for most of my life, I believed the forest made sense. I believed you could learn its rules the way you learn a trail map, that its dangers followed patterns, that every missing hiker had a reason behind their last footprints. I believed that if you listened closely enough, the land would tell you what you needed to know. But there are nights when the land speaks in ways no ranger is trained to hear, and no compass can guide you out of. I was 38 when all of this began, still young enough to think I had a handle on fear, but old enough to know I wasn't invincible. I worked patrol in a remote stretch of pine country that locals here in northern Washington simply call the hush. Not because it's quiet, but because the locals never speak about it above a whisper, and they have a way of making their silence feel like a warning. They're not dramatic people. They don't cling to legends for entertainment. So the first time I noticed how their faces tightened when I mentioned the deeper trails, those unmarked paths that twist between granite ridges and old fire scars, I felt a small ripple of unease I couldn't explain. They'd glance at each other, shake their heads, and mutter things like, "The old growth moves at night," or "Leave the caves alone and you'll be fine." I used to smile, thinking it was just folklore. Back then, I still believed every mystery had a biological explanation. A shadow passing outside a cabin window was a deer. That strange knocking sound at 3 a.m. was a branch cut in the wind. A scream echoing across the valley was a cougar's cry warped by distance. But I remember the moment that certainty began to erode. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. It was autumn. Cold enough that the night smelled of frost. The sky had the kind of clarity that makes every star look like a pinprick through dark fabric. I was on the clock, but relaxed, checking one of the outlier cabins rangers use as emergency shelters. It sits in a pocket valley, surrounded by pines that grow so tall and tight they blot out half the horizon. The area has a reputation among hikers. Compasses go sloppy, GPS flickers, and sound plays tricks. I used to think it was just the acoustics. Inside the cabin, I found everything normal. Stocked woodpile, emergency radio still functional, bare box untouched. I should have turned back before the frost thickened, but something kept me lingering by the doorway, some pull I didn't recognize yet. I stood there with my hand on the frame, waiting for, I don't know what, a feeling to settle, maybe, a sense of rightness. Instead, something else came. A faint knock, not on the cabin, not on any nearby tree. It came from deeper in the woods behind me. One knock, pause, another knock. Same spacing, same tone, like someone tapping on hollow wood with slow patience. I froze. I remember that vividly. Not fear, not even tension, just a sudden stillness in my chest, as if my body recognized something my mind hadn't caught up to. It didn't sound like an animal. Too deliberate, too even. And it carried in a way sound shouldn't carry in dense forest. I stepped off the porch, boots crunching in the frost. The air smelled sharply of sap and cold earth. I turned my head to pinpoint the direction, but the pine trunks played tricks. The knocks seemed to slide between them like water changing shape. 3 more knocks followed. Same rhythm, same slow, almost expectant cadence. My instincts told me to call it in. My pride told me it was probably a hiker messing around, someone who got turned around and wanted attention. That internal tug of war, the one between instinct and denial, would become familiar in the months to come. But back then, I chalked it up to inexperience, a ranger trying too hard to find rational explanations. So I went toward the sound. Every step felt heavier. The smell of the forest shifted subtly. Less crisp pine, more wet bark, like the inside of a fallen log. My breath puffed out in pale clouds. I scanned with my flashlight, but the beam caught only rough bark and thin mist hugging the ground. Then, the knocks stopped. Silence. Not the natural kind. This was the kind of silence that feels arranged, like someone holding their breath, waiting for you to react. I raised my radio, but before I could speak, something shifted behind me. Not footsteps. Not animal movement. More like the forest itself adjusting its posture. I spun. The flashlight caught nothing but swirling frost. Then a shape moved between the trees, tall, pale, and gone before my light could land on it. My chest constricted. My first thought wasn't bear or elk. It wasn't anything earthly. It was simply wrong. Too tall, too smooth in its movement, like it had never learned the rhythm of walking. But I dismissed it. I forced myself to think of all the logical explanations. Bad angle, imagination, refraction from the flashlight beam. Denial can be a powerful shelter when you're alone in the woods and don't want the world to change. I returned to the cabin quickly, shutting the door harder than I meant to. I stayed there for an hour, listening carefully. The knocks didn't return. When I finally stepped out and began my hike back to the station, the forest felt normal again. My breath filled the cold air, my boots made predictable sounds, my flashlight beam behaved. I convinced myself nothing had happened, but the locals knew better. The next morning, when I mentioned hearing strange knocking in the hush, old man Harland, who'd lived there longer than the trees themselves, looked up from his coffee and said something that stuck in my ribs like a splinter. He said, "They knock to see if you'll answer. Don't let them think you will." Them, not it. And then he refused to say another word. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the knocks, those evenly spaced taps echoing in the frost. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that Harlan was old and superstitious, that the forest plays with sound the same way water bends light. But beneath all the rationalizing, something stubborn and primal clung to the back of my mind. Why did the sound feel like it was meant for me? I didn't have an answer, only a sensation, like someone had pressed a finger just below my ribs and left it there, reminding me that the forest pays attention even when you think it doesn't. A week passed with no incidents. I handled routine patrols, trailhead checks, and maintenance. But the hush hung over me like a shadow. The deeper trails felt heavier, as if the air had thickened. And at night, when I tried to read in my cabin, I found myself checking the windows without knowing why. Then came the missing man. It was a Saturday morning when the call came in. A middle-aged hiker named Rowan, someone locals actually liked. A quiet man, former Coast Guard, always respectful of the land. And what mattered most, he wasn't reckless. He didn't cut corners. He'd gone for a solo hike near Ridgewater, one of the places the locals never mentioned unless they had to. His car was still at the trailhead, door unlocked, keys inside. That was the first wrong thing. Rowan didn't strike me as the kind of man who forgot simple survival habits. I was assigned lead on the initial search. The trail into Ridgewater is narrow, lined with pines so tall the sky becomes a thin river of light above you. I'd walked that path dozens of times. It had always felt straightforward, remote, sure, but not threatening. This time, it felt different, almost like the forest was aware of the search and had closed ranks. A thin mist gathered between the trees despite the day being clear, the kind of mist that moves without wind, drifting against the natural flow. I tried to ignore it, tried to stay professional, but every few minutes I caught myself listening for something I couldn't name. Half a mile in, we found the first sign. Rowan's water bottle upright in the middle of the trail as if gently placed rather than dropped. There were no scratches, no signs of a fall, no mud splatter. It was clean. Too clean. We spread out. My partner that day, a seasoned ranger named Holt, muttered that it didn't feel right. He wasn't the type to spook easily. I told him we keep moving, that we couldn't afford to treat this differently just because of folklore. But inside, I felt the same wrongness tightening in my chest, slowly twisting, slowly waking. About an hour later, I heard it again. Not knocking. This time it was something else. A sound like someone exhaling in short, uneven bursts. I stopped mid-step. Holt glanced over. I put a finger to my lips. There it was again. Exhale. Pause. Exhale, coming from maybe 30 yards to my left. Too controlled to be an animal, too careful. I motioned for Holt to stay put and move toward the noise. With every step, the forest grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me despite it being nearly 50 degrees. Pine needles glistened as if touched by frost. Something in my body recognized the shift before my mind did. My skin prickled, my heartbeat slowed instead of sped up, like my instincts were bracing for something I didn't want to see. When I reached the source of the sound, I froze. There, half hidden between two leaning pines, was a shirt. Rowan's shirt. Perfectly folded, not torn, not weathered, just placed. And the ground beneath it was smooth. No tracks, no disturbance, not even compression from someone kneeling. I crouched slowly, careful not to touch anything. The air smelled wrong, not like pine anymore, but like wet stone and something old. Not rot, something deeper. If cold had a scent, that's what it was. Holt's voice crackled in my radio, asking if I found anything. I told him yes, but my own voice sounded distant, like it was coming from outside my body. Before I could take a photo, the forest shifted again. A faint thump echoed from farther ahead. Not loud, more like something heavy settling onto soft ground. Then another thump, and another. Slow, measured, getting closer. I stood up, pulse finally kicking into a sprint. Holt whispered through the radio, "Is that you moving?" I didn't answer. Because something in me, something buried deep beneath training and logic, was breaking open and letting in a fear I didn't want to acknowledge. Whatever was walking toward me wasn't on 2 legs, but it wasn't on 4 either. The cadence was wrong, too heavy for a deer, too slow for a cougar, too deliberate for wind or rockfall. And every thump carried the faintest tremor through the ground, like the forest was reacting to it. I backed away, careful not to step on loose branches. Holt appeared between the trees a moment later, his face pale. He'd heard it too. We didn't speak, didn't need to. Instinct overrode protocol. We retreated the same way we came, step by controlled step, until the thumps faded. We regrouped with the rest of the search team an hour later and didn't mention it. Not the cold, not the shirt, not the sound, because sometimes admitting a thing makes it real. 3 days later, the weather turned hard and the official search suspended. No trace of Rowan ever surfaced. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric beyond that folded shirt. And no animal predation signs, which is unusual in disappearances around here. People talked, quietly, carefully, and more than a few avoided my eyes when I walked into town. That weekend, I visited Harland again. He didn't invite me in, just stood on his creaking porch, staring into the tree line like he expected something to emerge. I told him about the shirt, the cold, the thumping steps. When I finished, he sighed, a slow, tired exhale that sounded like resignation. He said, "You're starting to hear it. They don't show themselves to everyone, only those who listen wrong." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the ridge behind my cabin, the direction of Ridgewater, and he muttered something that didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a warning too late to matter. "Stay out of the caves." I opened my mouth to ask him more, but he'd already retreated inside and shut the door. And for reasons I still can't explain, the moment he said the word caves, a memory flickered behind my eyes. Unbidden, unwelcome. A dark opening in a granite wall. Cold air breathing out, and something tall shifting in the shadows. Except I had never been inside a cave in Ridgewater. At least, not that I remembered. I couldn't shake that flicker of memory. It clung to me like sap on skin, sticky, persistent, impossible to ignore. I told myself it was just suggestion, the mind filling blanks after Harlan's warning. But the more I tried to brush it aside, the more tangible it felt. Not like imagination, more like something I had forgotten on purpose. Over the next few weeks, my patrols took me deeper into the hush. Training said stick to marked routes, but instinct pulled me into the places people avoided. My feet knew those paths better than they should have. Sometimes I'd reach a bend in the trail and pause, realizing I had already predicted the shape of the next clearing. The curve of the rocks, the dip in the ground where rain collected, yet I had no memory of ever walking that way before. That's when the dreams began. They always started the same. Me standing outside a dark opening in the stone, night pressing at my back, wind moving past me like something exhaling slowly from the earth. Every time I raised my flashlight, and every time the beam broke off before it reached the far wall, like the cave swallowed light instead of reflecting it. And just before I woke, I would hear footsteps inside, slow, dragging, uneven, as if something too tall for the space was trying to move quietly. I'd wake soaked in sweat, pulse pounding, and the worst part wasn't the dream. It was the sensation that it wasn't a dream at all. It felt like a memory surfacing. One morning, after barely sleeping, I hiked into town early, hoping the cold air would clear my head. Instead, I ran into Holt near the ranger station garage. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were red, his jaw tense. I asked if everything was all right, thinking maybe stress from the search or personal issues. He hesitated before speaking. "Are you hearing things out there?" he asked quietly. My stomach tightened. I didn't answer. That was answer enough. He nodded once, a small, resigned motion. Then he told me he had been on patrol 2 nights earlier, near the old burn zone, said he'd heard something moving just beyond the tree line, something that moved with intention, not instinct. Said he called out to it, said it stopped moving, said it listened. But that wasn't the worst of it. He said it repeated his knock. 3 knocks, slow, precise, mirroring his rhythm exactly. He didn't tell anyone else. Not our supervisor, not the sheriff, just me. And when he said my name, his voice cracked like a branch under weight. "It's following the same pattern as last time," he whispered. "Last time." The phrase hit like cold water. "Last time what?" I asked. But he just shook his head. He wouldn't explain. Or maybe he couldn't. Before I could push, a radio call pulled him away. He left quickly, but the dread he carried stayed with me long after. That afternoon, I finally gave in to what had been eating at me for weeks. I decided to go to Ridgewater alone. The trails were dead quiet as I hiked in. Too quiet. Animals make noise even when they hide. Birds shift in branches. Squirrels dig. Insects hum. But that day, nothing moved. The silence felt structured, like a held breath, something waiting for me to step deeper. By the time I reached the clearing where we found Rowan's shirt, the sun had started to dip. The last rays of gold slanted through the trees, catching dust motes that drifted like slow snow. I stood there, trying to feel something familiar, some hint that I had been there before. Instead, I felt watched, not from one direction, from many, like multiple eyes blinked from the shadows, tracking my breath, my heartbeat, my thoughts. I turned in a slow circle, but the forest remained still. No movement. No sound. Then I saw it. Not the cave itself. Not yet. Just the faintest suggestion of an unnatural line of shadow between 2 wide boulders. A crack too sharp to be random. A curve too smooth to be natural erosion. My pulse jumped. I stepped closer. With every foot of distance closed, the air grew colder. My breath turned to mist again. The pine scent thinned, replaced by that same mineral chill I remembered from Rowan's shirt. The ground sloped slightly, guiding me toward the opening. Then, as I reached the boulders, the cave revealed itself. Not large, not dramatic, just an oval mouth in the stone, wide enough for a man to walk into without crouching. But it was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The shape looked too deliberate, too symmetrical, like something carved it with patience and intent. I shined my flashlight inside. The beam died after a few yards. Not faded, died. Completely swallowed. The darkness didn't behave like darkness. It felt like something pressing outward, resisting the intrusion of light. And just like in my dreams, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Dragging. Slow. Coming toward me. My body froze, anchored by instinct older than language. Fear didn't hit all at once. It rose gradually, like icy water filling my veins. Every hair on my neck lifted. My mouth went dry. My legs wanted to run, but something deeper wanted me to stay, for reasons I didn't understand, but that felt rooted in a memory buried too deep to reach. The footsteps grew louder, not in rhythm with human movement, not even animal. Something awkward, heavy. One step, a drag, another step, a scrape. Then a low sound drifted out from the dark. Not a growl, not a hiss. Something like breathing filtered through stone. Wet, uneven inhalations followed by long, trembling exhalations, as if whatever was inside had lungs too large for its body. I stepped back once. The darkness pulsed, yes, pulsed into the edge of the flashlight beam. I stumbled back again. Something shifted inside. Not a full movement, more like a tall shape leaning slightly, listening, waiting. Then a voice, not quite human, rumbled out softly, not words. Just a tone, a low, questioning hum, almost like it recognized me. My throat closed. I turned and bolted, stumbling through brush, crashing into branches, not caring about silence or protocol or what direction I was running. The forest blurred around me, colors streaking together in dark greens and amber light. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. Behind me, I heard the first deep thump, then another, not running, just following, steady, patient. When I finally burst onto the main trail, I didn't stop until I reached the ranger truck. My hands shook so violently I dropped the keys twice. As I drove out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, just one, I saw something tall moving through the trees behind me. Too tall for any man, too smooth for any animal. Its head angled slightly like it was listening for the sound of my breathing. I didn't sleep that night, not even a minute, because as the clock passed 3 a.m., the knocking began. Not outside my cabin, inside the walls, 3 knocks, slow, patient, waiting for me to answer. The knocking didn't stop after the first 3 taps. It came again, a few minutes later, then again, each time in a different spot, near the window, along the back wall, beneath the kitchen floorboards, like something circling the cabin, learning the boundaries, searching for a way in. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands pressed against my thighs to stop them from trembling. The clock on the wall glowed 3:27 a.m., the kind of hour when the world feels thin and the mind starts peeling apart from its logic. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that exhaustion can make phantom noises feel convincing. But the walls vibrated with every knock. The picture frames tilted, dust drifted down from the beams overhead. Something was physically striking the cabin. I finally stood, grabbing my flashlight, not because I thought the light would help, but because holding something made me feel less helpless. I stepped toward the front door and the knocking stopped instantly, as if it sensed my movement. The silence felt worse. I gripped the knob, hesitating. I knew opening the door was the worst decision I could make, but staying inside, cornered, felt even more dangerous. I took a breath, flicked the lock, and pulled the door open. Cold air swept in like a living thing, wrapping around me. The trees leaned in, their silhouettes trembling slightly in the breeze. Frost glimmered along the porch rails. But the forest was empty. No tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, no retreating shape. Nothing, until something caught my eye. Near the edge of the tree line, between 2 thick pines, something extremely tall stood perfectly still. So still I thought it might be a trick of the shadows. It had no clear outline, just a vertical shape darker than the forest around it. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a tree. It was something standing beside them, something that blended with the trunks like it had learned how to wear the forest as a disguise. My breath hitched. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I couldn't see its face, couldn't see details. But somehow I felt attention on me. Steady, unblinking, cold. Then it shifted. A slow lean as if craning its head. And the sound it made, barely audible, just a low vibration through the needles above, felt like a question I couldn't understand. I slammed the door. I backed away, heart hammering so loud the cabin seemed to pulse with it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my back against the opposite wall, flashlight pointed at the door, waiting for more knocks. None came. But as dawn crept into the sky, I noticed something carved faintly into the inside of the doorframe. Something I was absolutely certain hadn't been there before. 3 long vertical scratches. Not deep, not angry, more like a signature. By the time the sun fully rose, I had already packed my gear. I left the cabin and reported it in early for patrol, hoping daylight would pull me back into reason. But even in the morning light, the feeling lingered, that I had been marked, not hunted, not chased, watched, claimed. When I arrived at the station, Holt was already there, though his shift wasn't supposed to start until noon. He was pacing near the back door, eyes darting to the forest every few seconds. The moment he saw me, he walked over fast, almost desperate. He asked if I had heard knocking. I didn't answer with words. The look on my face told him enough. He exhaled shakily, running a hand across his hair. "We need to talk," he whispered. He led me away from the building, toward the empty maintenance yard behind the station. Away from others, away from ears. Once there, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him. Fear. Not the kind you confess easily, the kind you try to bury until it swallows you. He said, "This isn't the first time it's happened. Not here. Not to us." At first, I didn't understand. Then a cold dread slid into place as he continued. Years ago, before I joined the service, there had been another ranger, someone Holt had trained with. They had gone into Ridgewater together after a report of strange noises echoing through the valley, something like chanting, something like breathing through stone. Only one of them came back. Not dead, just changed. Withdrawn. Sleepless. Stopping mid-sentence to stare into the tree line as if hearing something no one else could. He quit the position, left town, and no one heard from him again. Holt said he never talked about what he saw. But the night before he left, he told Holt one thing. They live deeper than the caves, and they remember those who listen. The words clung to me like ice. I told Holt everything, every knock, every dream, every moment in the cave. When I finished, he looked sick. He said he heard dragging footsteps outside his window the night before, said something brushed its hand. He swore it was a hand along his siding. Slow, deliberate, listening. We made a plan, not a smart one, not a safe one. Just the only one that felt possible. We were going back to the cave. We agreed to go at dusk. Daylight for the approach, darkness for whatever revealed itself. We packed thermal layers, radios, extra flashlights, a flare gun. We told no one. Not supervisors, not search and rescue, not law enforcement. Protocol meant nothing anymore. Logic meant nothing. Something had crossed a line, stepped out of folklore and into our world. As we hiked toward Ridgewater in the fading light, I sensed it again, the forest watching, the silence tightening, the temperature dropping more with each step. Holt walked slightly ahead of me, shoulders tense, scanning constantly. When we reached the clearing, the sky had turned blue-black, with a thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the pines. The cave mouth stared out at us like an unblinking eye. We approached slowly. Holt raised his flashlight. The beam stopped at the same invisible wall, absorbed by the dark. I felt the cold breathing out from the opening, brushing against my clothes like invisible fingers. Then something moved inside. A soft scrape, a shift, a slow, dragging inhale, followed by a deep, low sound, a hum. The exact same pitch I had heard the night before. Holt whispered, "Dear God," and the darkness inside the cave leaned forward, not stepped, not lunged, just leaned like an impossibly tall figure bending its head to listen more closely. My knees almost buckled. For a moment, we stood there frozen, staring into the breathing dark, and then something unimaginable happened. The hum changed, lifted, tilted, and formed itself into the shape of a sound I knew. My name, not spoken clearly, not human, more like a vibration pulled through stone, but unmistakably me. Something inside the cave knew my name. I turned to run, but behind us, somewhere in the forest, another knock echoed. Not from one direction, from several. Like the trees themselves had learned the pattern. 3 knocks, slow, patient, calling us deeper. The knocking spread through the forest like a pulse, one trunk at a time, slow and deliberate, as if the entire hush had become a single living organism echoing its own heartbeat. Holt and I froze, backs pressed together, listening as knock after knock answered itself in a widening circle. The sound didn't travel the way sound should. It didn't fade with distance. It didn't echo. It was as if each tree was knocking from inside its own bark. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again, and beneath the rhythm the cave heaved a cold exhale, long enough to dim the air around our legs. Holt grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." But I couldn't move. Not because I was too afraid. Because something inside me tightened. Something old and buried. Something that felt like memory. A memory I shouldn't have. A memory that felt like it belonged to someone else. Or something else. I stared into the cave, and for the first time, I felt the truth crawling out of the dark. This wasn't the first time I'd been here. This wasn't the first time it had called my name. Something deep inside the cave shifted forward again. Taller now, filling more of the darkness, like it was unfolding slowly from the stone. Holt backed away until his boots scraped the dirt. He whispered my name once, and the cave answered him. Not mocking, not mimicking, repeating. As if it were practicing the shape of our sounds. My breath caught. Holt's hand tightened on my sleeve. For a moment, he looked like he might be sick. Then, with a sharp inhale, he yanked me backward. "Move," he hissed. "Move." And the spell broke. We tore away from the cave mouth, stumbling over roots and rocks. The forest shook with knocks, thousands it felt like, every trunk answering every other trunk, sinking into a rhythm that refracted through the branches. It sounded like communication, like signal, like warning. Behind us, something big stepped out of the cave. Not running, not rushing, walking. The ground trembled with each footfall. Holt pushed ahead, shouting for me not to look back. I tried to listen. I tried, but some force pulled my attention behind me, and I glanced over my shoulder just once, just long enough to see it step into the faint moonlight. Tall, too tall, stooped slightly as if the world was too small for its frame. Its body was pale but not white, like bone polished by water. Long arms that hung past its knees, a head tilted at an unnatural angle as though listening to something beneath our footsteps. But the worst part wasn't the height or the arms. It was the face, or rather the absence of one. Where eyes should have been, there were two long hollows, like the shape of a skull under skin. Where a mouth should have been, there was only a shallow indentation, as if it had once had a mouth and something had taken it away. Yet the sound it made, the hum, the breathing, the attempt at names, came from somewhere deeper inside its body. It took a step toward us, and the trees knocked again. Holt grabbed my jacket and dragged me forward. We barreled through the forest, ripping through brush, scraping against bark. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead. The knocks followed us, not just behind, but ahead, as if the forest was closing around us. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes. Hours. Time twisted the way it does in nightmares. But eventually the knocks grew fainter. The footsteps behind us slowed. The cold in the air thinned. And at last, mercifully, we burst onto the main trail just as our radios crackled back to life. Holt collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. I doubled over beside him, palms pressed to the dirt, heartbeat shaking my entire body. We didn't speak for a long time. When we finally did, it wasn't a conversation, just fragments. Did you see? Yes. Is it still? No idea. What was it? Silence. Neither of us even attempted to answer. We walked back to the station in numb quiet, helping each other keep balance when our legs shook too hard to stand on their own. When we arrived, we didn't go inside. We didn't file reports. We didn't turn in equipment. We sat on the steps outside until the sky lightened with morning, not sleeping, not blinking, barely breathing. And as dawn finally washed the forest gold, I realized something unsettling. The trees looked normal. No movement. No strange angles. No sense of watching. Like the night had been swallowed whole by sunrise. Holt eventually said he needed time. I didn't argue. We split without a plan, without a meeting time, without a single word about what came next. And for a long while after that, the hush remained quiet. But quiet changed meaning for me. Quiet wasn't peace. Quiet was waiting. Weeks passed. I patrolled the quieter trails. I avoided Ridgewater. I avoided anything that even resembled a cave. But sometimes, while walking along a ridge or clearing debris from a storm, I caught the forest making sounds it shouldn't, just subtle things. A tree creaking, even though the air was still. A breathing like hush coming from a direction without wind. A shadow bending at the wrong angle. And some nights, when the temperature dipped low, I woke to the faint tapping along the outside wall of my cabin. Not enough to panic. Just enough to remind me I had been heard. One evening, Holt appeared at my door unannounced. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken. He looked like he'd been fighting nightmares with no breaks in between. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't have to. He told me he was leaving the service. Effective immediately. No explanations. No goodbyes to the others. He said he couldn't stay. Not with the knocking coming back each night. Not with the shadows stretching longer across his yard than they should. Not with the feeling that something tall was watching him sleep. He handed me his badge. And then, trembling, he said something I will never forget. It knows your name better than mine. Be careful. He was gone before I could speak. After he left, the knocks grew more frequent. Never violent, never demanding, just insistent, as if patiently reminding me the forest hadn't forgotten. I considered quitting too, leaving the state, leaving everything. But the idea of abandoning the land felt wrong, like turning my back on a living thing that needed understanding, not escape. The hush was my responsibility, my burden, my story now. And there was something deeper binding me to it, something I finally allowed myself to recognize. I wasn't just scared of what lived in the caves. I was scared of why it remembered me. Because the dreams had continued, because the flashes of memory had sharpened, and because recently a new fragment surfaced. Me, standing at the cave's mouth, not as I am now, but younger, maybe years younger, flashlight in hand, breathing hard, walking inside, and something tall following behind me. If that memory is real, something happened long before I believed anything had happened at all. Something I buried so deep the forest itself had to remind me. The knocking hasn't stopped. It comes and goes with the temperature, with the moonlight, with the silence between breezes. Sometimes it taps from the trees outside, sometimes from the ground beneath the cabin. Sometimes when the night is especially still, I hear the faintest hum drifting through the pines, low, trembling, shaping itself almost into words. Not angry, not hunting, calling. The locals still whisper their warnings, still avoid Ridgewater, still lower their voices when night falls. They've lived beside this thing longer than I've been alive. They know the forest doesn't forget. And neither does whatever lives beneath it. I don't know why it chose me. I don't know why it knows my name. I don't know what memory is waiting to resurface the next time I dream of stone walls and cold breath. But I do know this. The forest doesn't just keep secrets. It keeps score. And some stories don't end when you leave the woods. They follow you, step for step, knock for knock, breath for breath, until you finally turn around and face what's been walking behind you. I am still a ranger, but I am no longer the protector of this place. I am its witness. I am its warning. And tonight, as frost settles over the hush and the pines begin their quiet knocking again, I step outside my cabin, look into the trembling dark, and whisper back into the trees, I hear you, and I remember. The first thing you learn out here is that the woods don't care how brave you think you are. They don't care about your training, your badge, your years on the job. The forest strips all that away until it's just you, your breath, and whatever is watching from behind the trees. And the night I realized that, truly realized it, was the first time I heard my own name carried through the pines like a cold breeze dragging broken syllables behind it. My name is Mason. I'm 38 years old, and for more than a decade I've worked as a ranger in the northern stretch of the Bitterroot Range, the side most people don't bother hiking. When folks talk about the Rockies, they imagine bright peaks and well-marked trails and maps that always match the land. Up here, the forest feels older than all of that, like it remembers a time before people and never quite forgave us for arriving. Locals call it the Whisper Belt. Travelers never hear that name because the locals don't say it loudly. They mutter it, almost like they're afraid the trees themselves might be listening. I didn't believe any of that in my first years. I came in with a rescue background, steady nerves, and that naive belief that fear was just a lack of information. If you can identify the threat, you can manage it. That's what I used to think. And then the forest began teaching me that some things don't want to be known. My cabin sits about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by a crown of tall pines leaning inward like they're conspiring. It's the place I sleep, but not the place I rest. I've never truly rested out here, not the kind that relaxes your bones. Some part of me has always stayed awake, listening, watching, waiting. Maybe that was instinct. Maybe something else. I still remember the first story that shook my confidence. It happened in my 3rd year, back when I still laughed at the older rangers when they warned me about the long shadows. Back when everything strange could be explained away with logic and long nights and a touch of fear I didn't want to admit. It started with a knock. I was doing paperwork in the cabin, the kind that piles up after a search and rescue week. It was late, after midnight, I think, when something hit the door. Not a fist. Not an animal paw, either. It was too measured, too precise. 3 taps, light, like knuckles. I stood up fast, the chair scraping the floor, and froze because it came again. 3 more. Same rhythm, same disturbing patience. Out here, you don't open your door at night unless you know who's on the other side. So I called out, asking if someone was hurt. No answer. I tried again, louder. Still nothing but wind pushing through the needles above the cabin, the kind of dry whispering sound that can trick your ears into hearing voices. I reached for my flashlight and stepped closer. Something in me tightened, the kind of instinctual tension I couldn't argue away even then. I didn't open the door. I looked through the small window instead. No one. Just the dark stretch of porch and the shadows beyond. I should have felt relieved. Instead, my skin crawled because the knock had been too close, too intentional, too human. I stepped back quietly as if whatever was outside might hear my heartbeat through the wood. I waited for the knock again. I waited so long, my legs started to ache. But nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to sit down again, but I didn't get back to the paperwork. My ears stayed tuned to the silence, and the silence felt heavier than footsteps. The next morning, when the sun finally bled through the pines, I went outside expecting to find tracks, anything to explain it. But the dirt was untouched. Not even the usual raccoon prints. Nothing. Like the night had erased itself. I told myself it was just an animal brushing against the door. Maybe a branch caught in the wind, maybe I misheard. All believable lies, but lies nonetheless. That was the opening. A gentle push. The second story the forest handed me wasn't gentle. It involved an old logger named Birch Mallow, a man built like the mountains he cut into for 40 years. Everyone knew him, and everyone respected him, even the locals who still whispered their cautionary tales. Birch didn't lift his eyes for ghost stories. He only believed in what he could see and what he could break with his hands. And yet, even he refused to talk about one particular hollow on the north side. He didn't mind that I worked patrol around it, but he told me once, quietly, like it tasted wrong in his mouth, "If you hear someone calling for help near that hollow, you turn around, no matter how real it sounds." I asked him why. He said, because the ones who went in after the voices never came back right. I thought he meant accidents, exposure, hallucinations, stress, the kind of things rangers deal with in extreme weather. I never imagined he meant something else, something that changed a man's eyes when you looked at him too long afterward. The call came on a cold September evening. I was on foot patrol when my radio crackled with a faint, broken message. A hiker reported hearing screams near the North Hollow, high-pitched, frantic, echoing through the trees. I felt my stomach drop. Birch's warning pressed against the back of my mind, but training kicked in. You hear screaming. You respond. You don't hesitate. The trail thinned as I approached, swallowed by undergrowth. The air turned colder. Not normal evening chill. Colder, like entering a pocket of winter. My breath fogged. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself it was adrenaline. Then I heard it, a voice drifting between the trees. Help, please, not a scream. A whispering plea. Too soft, too rhythmic, too close. I called out, announcing myself. The voice stopped. Branches snapped to my left, light but intentional. I raised my flashlight, scanning. The beam caught nothing but trunks and brambles, but the sound came again, behind me this time. Help me, I spun around, light shaking in my hand. No one. That was the moment the doubt started, not in the forest, but in myself. I had never doubted my senses before, but the voice was everywhere and nowhere, always just behind me, always just far enough that I couldn't pinpoint direction. I moved carefully, calling for the hiker who'd reported the screams. My voice trembled. I hated that. Then the woods went dead silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, just the oppressive stillness of a place holding its breath. That's when I saw the shape. Far between the trees, tall, white-gray, almost blending with the trunks. Too tall to be human, too still to be an animal. My breath caught and the forest seemed to lean closer, but when I blinked, the shape was gone. I backed away slowly. I didn't turn around, not until I reached the trail again where the air finally felt warm enough to breathe. Later that night, when I got back to the cabin, there was mud on the porch and a print. Not quite human, not quite animal, but unmistakably foot-shaped, with toes longer than any person's should be. And right beside it, drawn into the thin film of dirt like a finger had etched it there, was a single word, Mason. I stared at my name in the dirt for so long the shadows shifted around me. The sun was sinking behind the ridge, and the porch boards were cooling beneath my boots, but I couldn't move. There's something uniquely paralyzing about seeing your own name written by something you didn't see, something tall enough and silent enough to stand just beyond the trees without leaving a sound. Rangers are trained for danger, bears, storms, injuries, even hostile people. But we're not trained for this, for something that knows your name before you even know what it looks like. I cleaned the porch slowly, sweeping away the print and the word, but the feeling didn't leave. It clung to the back of my mind like a spider's thread, thin, invisible, always brushing the edge of awareness. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the cabin felt heavier. Every gust of wind felt like breath against the window. And just before dawn, right before exhaustion finally pinned me to sleep, I heard a sound from outside. 3 soft taps on the cabin door, the same rhythm as before. But this time, the taps weren't followed by silence. They were followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing across the porch like someone was deciding whether to try the handle. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there with the blanket pulled to my throat, feeling like a child pretending to be asleep so the monster under the bed would lose interest. The steps stopped. Then, after a few seconds of suffocating silence, something brushed against the siding, something tall enough to drag fingers across wood near the roofline. When morning came, the porch was clean again. No prints, no marks. The only evidence anything had been there was the sense of something watching me from the trees as I drank my coffee, the feeling that if I stepped too close to the forest line, I wouldn't come back the same. For weeks afterward, nothing happened. No knocks, no footsteps. The forest almost seemed to return to normal. Birds returned. The wind rustled through the pines in its usual indifferent way. Even the locals seemed less guarded when they talked about the Northern Hollow. Their shoulders relaxed, their voices shifted from wary whispers to normal conversation. I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it, that stress had exaggerated everything, that maybe Birch Mallow's old tales had wormed into my mind far more than I realized. Then winter came, and winter in the Bitterroot Range has a way of revealing truths you've been trying hard not to face. It was early December when we got the call. A lone snowshoer hadn't returned from a route not far from the North Hollow. He was experienced, careful, the kind of person who checks weather twice before stepping out, but a front had moved in faster than anyone expected. We had a narrow window of daylight to find him. I set out with another ranger, with a younger guy named Ivor, quiet and steady, good under pressure. Even he seemed uneasy the closer we got. The forest felt different in winter, sharper, clearer, as if the cold air stripped away the distractions of rustling leaves and insects. Sound traveled differently too. It echoed longer, hung heavier. We found the man's tracks near midday. They were erratic, weaving, as if he kept changing direction, as if he was confused or being led. Ivor knelt down, brushing snow from one imprint. He was running near the end, he said quietly. I didn't respond. My throat was tight. The tracks led us toward the hollow, and every step I took awakened that old instinctive dread deep in my stomach, the memory of the voice calling for help in soft, rhythmic breaths. Ivor didn't know the stories. I hadn't told him. I didn't want to infect him with fear he didn't earn. But the forest kept pushing. The wind picked up, slipping between the trees with a strange hum, almost a whistle. I tried to rationalize it. Snow, air pressure, narrow gaps between branches, the usual explanations. But somewhere beneath all those thoughts was another awareness. It sounded almost like words. Not fully formed, but close enough that my hands started to sweat inside my gloves. We found the snowshoer just past the ridge. He was alive, barely. kneeling in the snow with his head down, his hands pressed to his ears like he was trying to shut something out. His eyes were open but unfocused, like he was trapped in a thought he couldn't escape. Ivor called to him, gently at first, then louder. The man didn't respond. His lips were blue. His breath came in sharp, terrified bursts. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched so violently he almost knocked me over. Then he looked at me, and I knew instantly that whatever he'd heard out here had broken something in him. He whispered, voice cracking, "Tell it I didn't mean to follow." I froze. Ivor frowned. "Follow what?" The snowshoer stared past us toward the hollow and whispered one word, "The tall one." Ivor and I exchanged a look, and in that moment I saw a flicker of doubt in him, his first glimpse of the thing that lived beneath the stories. We helped the man up, guiding him back toward camp. His legs trembled with every step, but he wouldn't look behind him. Not once. On the way back, he spoke in fragments, half-thoughts broken by shivering and sobs. He said he'd heard someone calling for him from the trees. He said it knew his name. He said the voice sounded like someone drowning and speaking at the same time. And he said something had been walking alongside him in the snow, close enough that he could hear each step, but when he looked, there was nothing. And then, barely audible, he said the words that made the hair on my arms rise. It wanted me to come closer so it could see my face. We reached the base camp as daylight was fading, pulled him into the warming hut, called for evacuation. Ivor stayed with him while I stepped outside to breathe air that wasn't suffocating. The sky was turning purple, the pines silhouetted like jagged teeth against it. The cold bit into my cheeks, but I was sweating, my breath fogged in front of me, and for a moment I watched it fade into the dimming forest. Then the wind died. Not slowed, died. The entire forest went still, and in the silence that followed I heard it, soft, slow, familiar. 3 taps on the side of the warming hut. Ivor stepped out behind me. "Did you hear?" "Get back inside," I said sharply, grabbing his sleeve. "But go." He listened. He didn't question the fear in my voice. I turned slowly toward the far wall of the hut. Snowflakes drifted down, gathering silently. But something had moved there. Something tall enough to cast a faint shape against the siding before slipping out of view. Something that had followed us back. I stood there until the cold crept into my bones, but I didn't go back inside until the woods released their breath again and the wind finally returned, carrying with it a familiar whispering through the trees, like distant voices arguing softly among themselves. When I finally walked back to the cabin that night, long after the snowshoer had been airlifted away, there was a feeling I couldn't shake. The forest wasn't warning me anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for what? That was the question that hung in my mind like a weight. The forest didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't whisper the same way it used to. It felt charged, like the moment before lightning cracks open a sky. Even the other rangers noticed something off. They didn't admit it out loud, but I could see it in the way they tightened their grips on their radios, in the way they avoided talking about the North Hollow even in daylight, in the way their eyes drifted to the trees when they thought no one was watching. For me, that tension didn't fade. It followed me through each day, building pressure, a presence just out of sight, like fingers brushing the back of my neck every time I turned my back to the forest. The snowshoer was recovering at the hospital, at least physically, but I heard whispers that he hadn't spoken a full sentence since they brought him in. He just stared at the window, flinched at every sound, and refused to sleep unless the lights stayed on. The doctor said exposure trauma, but I knew better. The next story the woods gave me came during a week-long sweep of the backcountry trails after a series of unofficial campsites were reported. Normally, this was routine, cleanup, warnings, tracking campfire remains, but this time, something felt different from the moment I stepped past the ridge. The air wasn't just cold, it felt dense, heavy enough to press against my chest. My breath felt thick in my lungs. About 3 miles in, I found the first sign, a makeshift fire pit that hadn't fully burned out. The snow melted around it, exposing frozen dirt. But what caught my attention was a pattern carved into one of the nearby logs. A spiral, simple but drawn with jagged strokes, as if whoever carved it did so in the dark or while shaking. I'd seen spirals before, hikers doodling, kids messing around. But this one was different. It wasn't the design, it was where it pointed. Directly toward the North Hollow. I felt my throat tighten. I forced myself to keep moving. About half a mile farther, I found another fire pit, then another. A breadcrumb trail of abandoned campsites, growing colder and more recent the deeper I went. Something was driving people in, deeper and deeper, and none had stayed long enough to leave footprints leading out. That's when I saw the smoke. Thin, pale, hardly visible unless you caught it against the dark silhouette of the trees. It drifted upward like a muted signal, coming from a clearing just ahead. I approached cautiously, boots crunching on layers of frost, each step sending echoes bouncing between the silent trunks. When I reached the clearing, the fire was still burning, but no one was there. A small tent lay collapsed, half buried in the snow, the fabric torn in 2 different directions. A backpack sat open, contents spilled in a wide arc, clothes, a flashlight, a notebook, a canteen. But no tracks led away. None. The snow around the clearing was undisturbed, pristine except for the gear and the fire. The flames crackled softly, throwing distorted shadows across the tree line, shadows that seemed too long for the trees casting them. I circled the fire slowly. My eyes kept darting to the trees. There were no footprints, no animal prints, nothing. Then, from somewhere behind me, a branch snapped. I turned fast, hand on my sidearm. No one, but the forest felt wrong, like something had moved just out of sight. I crouched beside the abandoned notebook, the pages fluttering in the faint heat of the fire. The writing was frantic, words scrawled over each other. Most of it was unreadable, but a few sentences stood out, carved deep into the page. It followed me again. Don't look at its face. It stands between the trees where there should be no space. And then, on the final page, if it says your name, don't answer. A gust of cold air swept through the clearing, strong enough to make the flames lean sideways. The pines groaned, bending slightly as if pushed from above. I stood up slowly, forcing my breath steady. That was when a voice called my name. Not loud, not screamed. Soft, almost gentle. Mason. The sound threaded between the trees, weaving around trunks, dipping into shadows before rising again on the other side of the clearing. Mason, I felt my chest tighten. Something primal inside me recoiled. I stepped back automatically, boots slipping slightly on the frozen ground. My flashlight beam wavered, then steadied as I forced myself to breathe. Voices carry strangely in winter. That's what I told myself. Echoes, wind patterns, anything but what it sounded like. A voice trying to imitate a human but missing something essential. I didn't answer. Every instinct told me not to. The voice came again, closer. Mason, this time, it felt as if it came from directly behind me. I spun around, hand gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. The beam cut through the darkness, catching only snow and trunks. No shape, no movement, just the empty forest. But the trees felt too close. I started backing out of the clearing, watching every angle, scanning for any hint of movement. My breath fogged the air in quick bursts. Sweat trickled down my spine despite the freezing temperature. When I finally reached the trail again, the snow suddenly changed. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. It was disturbed, not by footprints, by drag marks, long, deep grooves cut through the snow as if something heavy had been pulled across it. The tracks were fresh, edges still sharp, untouched by wind. They led from the trail into the hollow. My mind scrambled for explanations. An injured animal, a fallen tree, the hiker dragging gear, but nothing fit the shape of the grooves. They were too wide, too clean, too deliberate. I followed them only far enough to confirm what I already feared. At the mouth of the hollow, the tracks simply stopped, not faded. Stopped. As if whatever had made them had simply lifted off the ground. A sound rose from deep within the hollow, a slow, vibrating hum like breath passing through a cavernous throat. The air grew colder, forming crystals in my eyelashes. My legs trembled, and I stepped back without realizing it. That was when the voice spoke again. Not behind me this time, not around me, but from inside the hollow. It stretched the syllables of my name like it was tasting them. Mason. The sound was deeper now, closer, echoing through the rock in a way no human voice could. I turned and ran. Not a steady, trained retreat, not a controlled pullback. I ran the way prey runs, fast, blind, driven by instinct older than language. The cold air tore at my throat as I sprinted through the trees, like branches slapping my arms, snow kicking up behind me. And above the pounding of my heartbeat, I heard something following. Not footsteps, breathing, long, slow, heavy, like something massive inhaling behind me. When I finally reached the ridge, my legs nearly gave out. I collapsed against a fallen log, chest heaving, lungs burning. The air here was warmer. The trees felt open again. The forest was alive with distant sounds, wind, birds, branches shifting. Normal. But behind me, the hollow remained silent. Too silent. And even though I couldn't see into it from where I stood, I felt it watching. Not with eyes, with awareness. That was the moment I realized something I should have understood long before. The forest wasn't haunted by something, it belonged to something. And that something had noticed me. Being noticed by the forest wasn't like being seen by a person. People look at you, evaluate you, measure you against whatever image they carry. But the forest, this thing inside it, it didn't look. It recognized. It marked. It felt like stepping into a story older than anything human, a story that had no interest in my rules, my logic, or my boundaries. It was as if the line between me and the woods had thinned, and something that shouldn't have crossed had slipped through. After that day, everything changed. The forest wasn't the same. Trails I'd walked for years suddenly felt unfamiliar. Trees leaning in subtly different directions, shadows falling at angles that didn't match the sun. Even the air carried a new heaviness, as if the woods were holding something in, like a breath that never fully released. Back at the station, Ivor avoided meeting my eyes. The others talked quietly when they thought I wasn't listening. They sensed something in me. The way I paused before every doorway, the way my voice dropped when I mentioned anything near the North Hollow. But none of them asked directly. Rangers don't often ask questions they're afraid to hear the honest answer to. Then came the night that carved its place into me like a scar. The call came in at dusk, a family reporting strange sounds near their campsite deeper in the backcountry. They'd heard what they described as a person walking circles around their tent. But when they called out, whoever it was didn't respond. Then footsteps stopped. Then the breathing started. Not heavy, they said. Just wrong. Wrong. Ivor and I were dispatched. It should have been routine. But the moment I stepped off the station porch into the twilight, the air felt colder than it should have been. A thin mist crept low through the trees, clinging to the roots like fingers. The wind was still, unnaturally still, as if listening. We hiked fast, covering the miles in under an hour. The family waited for us near the trailhead, bundled in coats, eyes wide, clothes still dusted with pine needles as though they had fled in a hurry. The father explained what they'd heard, while the mother kept checking the tree line, flinching at every rustle. It sounded like footsteps, he repeated. Slow ones, heavy. They went around the tent, over and over. But when I unzipped the flap and shined my light, there was nothing there. Nothing. But we heard breathing. Right next to us, right at the tent wall. Ivor shot me a glance, the kind that said he was thinking the same thing I was. The same thing we didn't want to say out loud. We told the family to stay near the trailhead while we checked the site. The forest seemed to swallow us as we hiked in. The last light faded behind the ridge, and shadows stretched long between the pines, weaving together like strands of something living. The deeper we went, the more the sounds faded. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. The campsite wasn't far from the hollow. I felt that before I saw the clearing. The trees thinned abruptly, opening to a small circle of snow-covered earth. The fire pit was cold. Footprints surrounded the tent, human footprints from the family. But around the edge, circling the site in an almost perfect ring, the snow showed something else. Tracks. Long, deep impressions, but not footprints. Handprints. huge ones. Fingers splayed like something had used its hands to walk around the tent. Marks dug into the snow where fingertips had pressed, long grooves trailing behind them. Ivor crouched down, shining his light across them. What kind of? Don't finish that, I said too sharply. He stared at me, confused, but I didn't explain. I couldn't. The question itself felt dangerous. We paced around the perimeter. The handprints circled the tent once, twice, 3 times. Each loop grew slightly closer, inward, like whatever had made them was spiraling toward the center, toward the people inside. A cold sweat built beneath my jacket. My breath fogged the air in shallow bursts. Then we found the spot where the circles stopped, where the prints ended inches from the tent wall. The snow was sunken, compacted by weight, as if something had crouched there for a long time, watching, listening, breathing. Ivor swallowed hard. Is this a prank? A bear? What? A sound cut him off. A whisper. Not a voice, not exactly, but something close. It rose from the trees behind us, drifting on the still air like smoke easing through cracks in a wall. It carried no shape, no syllables, just a tone that brushed the edge of familiarity, like something trying to mimic language without understanding it. Ivor turned, flashlight trembling in his hand. Did you hear? The whisper came again. Longer this time, sliding between the trunks, weaving from left to right as if circling us the same way it had circled the tent. My chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. I felt the instinct again, the prey instinct. Not to fight, not to shout, but to hide. But we were already too exposed. I raised my light slowly, sweeping the trees. I shouldn't have looked up. Between 2 pines higher than any person should be able to stand, something moved. Not fully seen, not fully formed, just a pale shape slipping back into shadow, tall and thin, limbs too long, head angled in a way no human neck could bend. Ivor gasped. He saw it too. Mason, he whispered, voice trembling. What did we just see? I didn't answer, because the whisper came again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing, closer, too close. Then another whisper followed, and another, surrounding us. Layers of sound, all mimicking the same breathy rhythm. Ivor stepped back. We need to go. We need to go now. But the forest disagreed. It hummed, deep and low, as if the ground itself were vibrating beneath us. The trees swayed, not with wind, but with movement deeper inside the woods. A shifting, a stirring. Then the temperature dropped so fast I felt my breath freeze mid-exhale, and from the edge of the clearing, no more than 20 feet away, a shape stepped forward. Tall, skeletal, gray-white like the trunk behind it. Its arms hung low, fingertips nearly brushing the snow. Its chest rose and fell slowly, but the breath made no sound, and its head was angled downward as if it were studying us from above, face hidden behind matted hair. Ivor's legs locked. Mine did too. The thing lifted its head. I didn't see its eyes, not fully, but I saw the space where eyes should have been, a hollow depth, a darkness that didn't reflect our lights, and then it spoke, not with a mouth, not with air, but with something deeper. Mason. Hearing my name in that voice was like feeling ice slide beneath my skin. Every hair on my body stood straight up. I heard my heartbeat pounding in my ears, frantic and desperate. Ivor whispered my name, terrified. Mason, run. But the creature, whatever it was, tilted its head further as if it were listening to us, learning us. Then something happened that swallowed every ounce of courage I had. It said Ivor's name. Perfectly. Calmly. Ivor. He choked on a scream. I grabbed his coat, yanking him backward. Go! The creature moved. Not fast. Not slow. Just wrong. Its limbs bent at angles that shouldn't exist. Its weight made no sound on the snow. It advanced as if pulled by strings. Ivor snapped out of his paralysis and bolted. We ran through the trees, branches slicing our arms, our legs, our faces. Behind us, the whispers rose like a storm of voices, layered and overlapping, creating a chorus of something that wasn't language but felt close enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I only heard it. The sound of something enormous moving through the trees with impossible silence. When we broke onto the main trail, Ivor collapsed, gasping, shaking so hard he couldn't speak. I trained my flashlight behind us, expecting to see the creature step out of the tree line. but nothing appeared. Only the darkness watched. The forest's breath held. Ivor whispered, voice cracking, "It knows us." I didn't correct him, because he was right. And worse, I knew this wasn't the end. The forest wasn't just aware of us anymore. We were part of it now. And it wasn't finished. It wasn't finished with us, not by a long shot. I felt it in my bones, in the way the forest never fully released its hold on me after that night. Ivor took leave shortly after. No one questioned it. His hands still shook whenever a branch snapped outside the station. He avoided the windows. He wouldn't walk within 10 feet of the tree line. I didn't blame him. I envied him for getting away. But I stayed. People always ask rangers why we stay, why we keep walking into the dark, why we return to places that leave us changed. The truth is simple. We know that someone has to be the one who doesn't run, the one who listens when others hear nothing, the one who stands in the gap between fear and the people who trust us to know these woods. But there's another truth I didn't admit until much later. I stayed because the forest had focused on me, and some part of me believed that if I left, it would follow. Winter settled deeper. Snow piled high along the ridges, muting sound, burying trails, pressing its cold weight on the land. The days grew short. Nights stretched long and endless, and the hollow felt like a living thing, pulsing with a presence that shifted in the dark. The last story the woods gave me came 3 days after the solstice. A storm had blown in overnight, heavy enough to drop trees across the old access road. The station radio crackled that morning with a call from 2 hikers stranded near the ridge. They had been camping out longer than they planned, waiting out the weather, but now one of them was injured. Twisted ankle, maybe broken. They needed help. I listened to the call twice. Something in the man's voice made my skin prickle. Fear, not of the injury, not of the storm. Fear of something else, something behind the hesitation in his words, something he wouldn't say. I radioed back that I was on my way. The trail was buried, every landmark softened beneath feet of new snow. My snowshoes sank deeper with every step. The wind tore through the pines in long, keening breaths, and every gust carried the faintest echo of something wrong, like a voice smothered beneath the storm. It took me nearly an hour to reach the ridge. I found the first hiker standing beside a fallen tree, bundled in layers so thick I barely recognized him. His face was pale, his eyes darted constantly to the tree line. He waved me over with frantic urgency. "You came alone?" he asked, voice trembling more from fear than cold. "I was closest," I answered. "Where's your partner?" He just pointed. "Toward the hollow." A shock hit my stomach like a fist. "He fell," the man said quickly, breath fogging. "Went looking for firewood. I told him not to go that far. I told him." He stopped. Breath hitched, his jaw clenched. He said he heard someone calling his name. My heart sank. "What direction?" I asked, though I already knew. He pointed again. I told him to stay put, keep warm, and radio if anything changed. Then I turned toward the hollow, feeling every instinct in me scream to stop, to turn around, to leave him, leave everything, run until the trees gave out and the world felt normal again. But I went anyway. The snow was deeper here, the silence heavier. With every step, the forest seemed to pull inward, narrowing, closing me in. My breath came out in ragged clouds, a cold gnawed into my gloves. My heartbeat felt too loud, too exposed. Halfway down the slope, I found the first sign, a glove. Torn. Fingers shredded, blood on the snow, already frozen. I pressed on. The spiral of trees that marked the edge of the hollow rose ahead, each trunk leaning inward, converging like ribs forming a cage. The air grew colder still, so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. And then I heard it. Not a voice at first, a sound like something dragging across stone, slow, heavy, wet. Then the voice followed, soft, drifting, pulled apart by the wind. "Help," my breath stilled. Another whisper. "Please, help." I wanted to believe it was the injured hiker. I wanted to believe it more desperately than anything in my life. But the cadence, the tone, the way it slithered between the trees, it wasn't human. Not fully. I moved forward anyway, every sense shaking, every muscle tight. The snow dipped sharply, dropping into the hollow like a bowl carved into the earth. The The shadows here felt thicker, darker, crawling across the ground like spilled ink. I called out the hiker's name. Silence. Then, a figure lurched out from behind a fallen log. I froze. The hiker collapsed into the snow, half crawling, half dragging himself. Blood streaked his pant leg. His face was contorted with fear so deep it seemed to hollow him out. "Don't," he gasped, voice cracking. "Don't let it see you. Don't turn around. Don't." A sound rose behind me. Not footsteps. A long inhale, slow, deep, cold enough to freeze the air in my throat. I closed my eyes. "Don't look at its face," the hiker whispered. Something tall shifted behind me, casting a long shadow across the snow. Its breathing slid through the hollow like a heavy curtain being drawn. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to turn, to look, to do anything but stay still. But I stayed. The creature stepped closer. Snow didn't crunch beneath it. The air cooled with each inch it approached, sinking into my bones. A thin, skeletal hand brushed my shoulder, light as a feather, cold as the grave. My breath seized, my vision blurred. And then it spoke. Not my name this time. A single command whispered with the weight of centuries. Stay. Something inside me cracked. I felt myself leaning forward, as if pulled by invisible strings. My knees weakened, my vision tunneled. The hiker screamed. The creature's hand lifted. The spell broke. I grabbed the injured man, hauled him to his feet, and ran. The forest erupted in motion behind us, whispers rising, trees bowing, snow exploding upward as if something massive tore through it. The creature's voice chased us, deeper, louder, furious. Stay. I didn't look back. We didn't stop running until the ridge leveled out and the world felt real again. The wind returned. The sounds of the forest came back. The air warmed enough to breathe. When we reached the first hiker, he stared at us like he couldn't believe we were alive. I radioed for immediate extraction. Not for rescue, for escape. Later that night, long after the hikers were taken to safety and the station lights were out, I sat alone in my cabin, staring at the pines. Frost crawled across the windows. The forest was silent, completely silent. And then a single whisper drifted from the tree line. Not my name, not a threat, just a reminder, a promise, soon. I stood there, rooted, breath shallow, heart echoing in my ears, because I finally understood something I hadn't let myself admit. The forest didn't want to kill me. It wanted to keep me. It wanted to claim me the way it had claimed others, folding me into the quiet stories only the pines remember. It wanted me to join the echoes haunting the hollow, the whispers that drift through the branches long after sundown. But I'm still here, still standing, still breathing. And every day I choose to walk back into those woods, not because I'm fearless, but because fear doesn't own me. It shapes me, it sharpens me. And somewhere in that darkness, beneath the weight of the trees and the breath of the cold earth, lies a truth older than any ranger, older than any legend, older than the forest itself. The spirits of the pines are real, and they remember every name they whisper, including mine.